"Go ahead," Ethan Caldwell said, his voice smooth and careless. "It's just hair, it'll grow back." The room answered him with laughter, soft at first, then swelling under the glow of crystal chandeliers that spilled warm light across polished marble floors, where a single black strand drifted down like ash, catching the reflection of 100 expensive shoes that never moved to stop it, never shifted, never hesitated. And at the center of it all stood Ava Brooks, still as a sculpture, her uniform pressed, her hands resting quietly at her sides as the quiet hum of the clippers faded into a silence so thin it almost rang, a silence broken only by the faint clink of a champagne glass somewhere in the distance, and the low murmur of guests pretending this was normal, as if dignity could be measured in dollars and erased just as easily, as if a person could disappear simply because no one important chose to see them. And for a moment the camera of the mind lingers not on Ethan, not on his smirk, or the casual arrogance in the way he leaned back like he had just finished a harmless joke, but on Ava's eyes, steady and unblinking, reflecting the chandelier light like polished glass, revealing nothing, offering nothing, as though whatever storm might have lived behind them had already passed long before this night began. Because Ava Brooks was used to rooms like this, rooms where people spoke in numbers instead of names, where silence was expected from those who served, where invisibility was the first rule and survival the second. And tonight was supposed to be no different, just another shift, another quiet evening moving between tables, refilling glasses, adjusting place settings, blending into the background of a family whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines alike. The Caldwell family, architects of a $2 billion empire built on precision, control, and the quiet assumption that nothing beneath them could ever truly rise. And yet something about this moment lingered longer than it should have. Not because of what had happened, but because of what didn't happen. No apology, no hesitation, not even a flicker of doubt in the faces of Ethan's parents who stood just a few feet away, watching with the same distant amusement one might reserve for a passing inconvenience. Their silence louder than any command, their approval woven into the fabric of the room, and still Ava didn't move, didn't reach up, didn't react the way anyone expected her to. Instead, she lifted her chin just slightly, enough for the light to catch the curve of her face, enough for those watching closely to feel something shift without understanding why. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost quiet, yet it carried through the room with a clarity that didn't belong to someone in her position. "You should remember this moment," she said, not looking at Ethan, but past him, as if addressing something larger than the room itself, something unseen, something inevitable. And for a fraction of a second the laughter faltered, just enough to leave a crack in the air before it sealed again, dismissed as nothing, brushed aside like everything else about her, because to them she was just a maid, just another face that would fade by morning, just another story that wouldn't matter. And yet, as Ava turned, her steps measured, her posture unchanged. There was something in the way the light followed her, something in the way the silence seemed to stretch just a little longer after she left, as if the room itself had registered a shift no one was ready to acknowledge, as if somewhere beneath the polished surfaces and rehearsed smiles, something had already begun. The service hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet, a quiet contrast to the echoing laughter she had just left behind, and Ava Brooks walked through it without rushing, her steps even, her breath steady, as if nothing had shifted at all, as if this night were no different from any other shift she had worked in buildings just like this one, where the lights were always too bright, and the air always carried the weight of someone else's wealth. But the difference was not in the hallway or the silence, or even the way the security camera above the exit door blinked its red light at precise intervals. The difference was in the absence of something, the absence of hesitation, the absence of doubt, because Ava did not reach for her head, did not check her reflection in the narrow glass panel by the door, did not react the way anyone watching might have expected her to. Instead, she paused only once, her hand resting lightly on the metal push bar, her reflection faint and distorted in the brushed steel, and for a second the world narrowed to that small frame, her eyes catching the dim light, calm, focused, unbroken. Then the door opened with a soft click and the cool night air slipped in, carrying with it the distant hum of traffic and the quiet pulse of a city that never noticed who came and went from places like this. And Ava stepped outside into the wide driveway that curved around the Caldwell estate, the gravel crunching softly. Beneath her shoes, the massive columns of the house rising behind her like something permanent and untouchable, as if nothing that happened inside could ever truly reach beyond those walls, as if consequences had never learned how to cross that distance. And yet as she moved past the line of parked luxury cars, their polished surfaces reflecting the soft glow of the estate lights, there was a stillness in her posture that did not belong to someone leaving empty-handed, not to someone who had just been dismissed, because Ava Brooks had always understood something most people in rooms like that never did. That power did not announce itself. It did not need permission, and it rarely looked the way people expected it to look, especially not when it had learned how to wait. And as she reached the edge of the property, where the paved driveway met the darker stretch of the road beyond, she slipped her hand into the pocket of her coat and pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up her face in a soft blue glow. Not hurried, not frantic, just deliberate, her thumb hovering for a moment as if measuring something unseen, then moving with quiet certainty, tapping once, then again, the reflection of code and numbers flickering briefly across her eyes before disappearing. And somewhere far from that quiet roadside, in offices filled with glass and steel and digital walls of data, something small shifted. Something so subtle it did not yet have a name. A delay in a system check. A pause in a routine process. Nothing anyone would notice. Not yet. And Ava lowered the phone slowly, her gaze lifting back toward the house one last time. Not with anger, not with regret, but with a kind of still understanding, as if the moment inside had already been filed away, already completed. And without another word, without another glance, she turned and began walking down the darkened road, her figure growing smaller under the space streetlights, each step quiet, measured, and certain, as though whatever came next had already been set in motion long before anyone in that brightly lit room had decided she was invisible. Morning did not arrive gently inside Caldwell Tower. It arrived in numbers and screens flickering to life across 47 floors of glass and steel, in the low hum of servers that had never once failed, in the quiet confidence of a system that had always done exactly what it was built to do. And at 8:02 a.m., the first anomaly appeared. Not dramatic, not loud, just a delay. A transaction that should have cleared in less than a second, holding for 3, then 5, then returning an error code. No one in the room immediately recognized, and across the trading floor analysts barely looked up at first, fingers still moving across keyboards, voices still calm, because small delays happened, systems needed resets, routine checks solved everything. That was the belief, that was the structure that held the Caldwell empire together, until 8:07 when the second alert appeared, then the third, and this time someone frowned, leaned closer to the screen, called over a colleague, their voices, lowering, tightening, the way voices do when something feels off but has not yet been named. And by 8:10 the room had shifted, chairs rolling back, screens refreshing again and again, the quiet rhythm breaking into scattered fragments of confusion as numbers failed to align, as access points that had always opened instantly began returning denials. And somewhere above them, in a corner office lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, Richard Caldwell stood with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the city stretch out in perfect order, unaware that inside his own systems that order was beginning to bend. Not collapse, not yet, just bend, like pressure applied slowly and precisely at the right point. And when his assistant stepped in without knocking, something she had never done in 10 years, he turned, irritation already forming before she spoke. But it faded when he saw her face, pale, controlled, but strained in a way that did not belong in this building. "There is an issue with the financial network," she said, careful, measured, but unable to hide the urgency beneath it. And Richard set the coffee down without drinking it, because men like him understood risk, they understood numbers, they understood control, and control was something that did not simply disappear, it was something that was taken piece by piece, And as he walked toward the wall of screens, each one now flashing alerts that were multiplying faster than his team could contain, he felt something unfamiliar press quietly against his chest. Not panic, not yet, but recognition, the kind that arrives before understanding, the kind that whispers that something has already moved beyond your reach. And down on the trading floor, someone finally said it out loud. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the words to settle into the air. "We are locked out." And the room fell into a different kind of silence, not the polished silence of wealth, not the curated stillness of power, but the raw, uncertain quiet of a system that no longer responded. And far from the tower, miles away in a small apartment where the morning light filtered softly through thin curtains, Ava Brooks sat at a simple desk, her laptop open, her posture relaxed, the screen reflecting lines of code that moved with quiet precision. Her fingers still now, her eyes steady, as if she were not watching something break, but something reveal itself exactly as it was always meant to. By 8:23 a.m., the pattern was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, and the calm precision that had once defined every movement inside Caldwell Tower had fractured into something sharper, faster, voices overlapping, instructions repeated, screens refreshing in rapid succession, as if speed alone could force the system back into obedience. But nothing responded the way it was supposed to, nothing aligned. And the deeper the engineers reached into the architecture, the stranger it became, because this was not a failure, not a crash, not something broken in the traditional sense. It was something controlled, something deliberate, like doors being closed one by one in a building no one realized they were trapped inside. And Richard Caldwell stood at the center of it, his jaw set, his eyes scanning lines of data that should have made sense, but did not, because every override he attempted returned the same result. Denied, not delayed, not corrupted, but denied with a level of authority that should not have existed above his own. And that was when the first real shift happened, not in the system, but in him, because men like Richard did not fear loss. They feared losing control. And this was control slipping in a way he had never experienced before, precise, calculated, and completely outside his reach. And across the floor, someone finally pulled up the access logs, fingers trembling just slightly as they traced the origin of the lockouts, expecting an external breach, an outside threat, something they could name and isolate. But what they found instead did not match any pattern they knew. The permissions were internal, deeply embedded, written into the foundation of the system itself, not added, not injected, but built as if a structure they had trusted had always contained this possibility, waiting. And when a name appeared on the screen, it did not come with an alarm or a warning. It simply existed there in quiet certainty, a line of authorization that carried more weight than any executive credential in the building. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the name did not belong. It did not fit the hierarchy they understood, and yet it sat above all of them, undeniable, unmovable. And Richard stepped closer, his reflection merging with the glass of the display as he read it again, slower this time, as if repetition might change what it meant. Ava Brooks, the letters steady, unblinking, holding their place against every attempt to override them. And something in the room shifted. In response, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, like a foundation cracking beneath polished floors, because suddenly the events of the night before were no longer separate, no longer dismissed. They connected in a way no one had anticipated, and across the building phones began to ring. Partners calling, investors asking questions, contracts stalling in real time as systems failed to confirm what they had always confirmed instantly, and the weight of it spread outward, faster than anyone could contain. While in that small apartment miles away, Ava remained still, her gaze resting on the screen for only a moment longer before she closed the laptop with a soft, deliberate motion, the room falling into quiet again as the morning light shifted across the desk, illuminating nothing more than a simple space. No signs of wealth, no evidence of power, just stillness, the kind that does not need to announce itself, because what had already been set in motion did not require her presence anymore. It only required time. By 8:41, the illusion of containment was gone. Not shattered in a dramatic collapse, but stretched thin across too many failures happening at once. Like a system trying to breathe through a space that kept narrowing, and inside Caldwell Tower, every screen now carried the same quiet message of refusal. Transactions pending without resolution, access points returning denials with a consistency that felt intentional. And the executives who once moved through this space with measured certainty now stood closer together, voices lower, sharper, no longer speaking in projections or forecasts, but in immediate questions that had no clear answers. And Richard Caldwell remained at the center of it all, his posture rigid, his mind moving faster than the chaos around him, because he had built his empire on anticipating risk, on identifying weak points before they could be exploited. And yet this was something else entirely, not a weakness, not an oversight, but a design he did not recognize. And that realization settled into him with a weight that was difficult to ignore. Because if his system had been designed this way, then someone had always held a level of control beyond his own, and that thought did not belong in his world. And across the room a senior engineer spoke carefully, choosing each word as if precision alone might slow the situation down, explaining that the lockout protocols were not external, not triggered by intrusion, but embedded deep within the systems. Architecture, activated through permissions that overrode every executive-level clearance, including Richard's, and for a moment no one responded because the implication was too large, too complete, and when the name was spoken again, Ava Brooks, it did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like a fact, something that had been there all along, unnoticed, underestimated, and suddenly impossible to ignore. And as the weight of that name settled into the room, the connections began to form. Not all at once, but piece by piece, the memory of a quiet presence moving through the house the night before, the stillness in her voice, the absence of reaction where reaction was expected, the single sentence she had spoken, and Richard's expression shifted, not outwardly, not in a way most would notice, but internally, the kind of shift that happens when certainty is replaced by understanding. And it was not anger that rose first, not even fear, but recognition, the slow realization that this was not chaos. This was control being exercised with precision, and outside, the building the effects had already begun to ripple outward, partners delaying calls, automated systems failing to confirm transactions, a hesitation spreading through networks that had once operated seamlessly, and the market, sensitive to even the smallest disruption, began to respond in quiet increments, numbers adjusting, values shifting, nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to signal that something was wrong, something significant. And inside that small apartment miles away, Ava Brooks stood by the window now, the city stretching out beneath a pale morning sky, her reflection faint in the glass, her expression unchanged, because for her this was not a moment of reaction. It was a continuation, a process unfolding exactly as it had been. Set, each step measured, each outcome anticipated, and she did not rush, did not celebrate, did not even watch closely anymore, because the work had already been done, the structure had already been revealed, and what remained was simply the world catching up to a truth it had chosen not to see until now. By 9:05 a.m., the noise inside Caldwell Tower had changed. No longer sharp or frantic, but uneven, like a room learning how to breathe again after realizing the air was thinner than it should be, and conversations that once overlapped with urgency now broke apart into smaller fragments. Quieter, more deliberate, because there was nothing left to rush toward, no immediate solution to chase. Only the slow awareness that whatever had been set in motion was operating on a level they could not interrupt. And Richard Caldwell stood alone now in his office, the glass walls around him reflecting a city that continued forward without hesitation. Cars moving in steady lines, people crossing streets with the quiet confidence of routine, a world untouched by what was unfolding just floors below. And he watched it for a moment, not to escape the situation, but to measure it, to place it against something larger, something stable. Because men like him relied on perspective when control slipped, and yet Even that did not settle the weight pressing quietly into his chest, because this was not a market fluctuation, not a negotiation gone wrong. This was something more precise, more intentional. And it carried a signature he could no longer ignore. And behind him the screen continued to display the same unchanging line of authorization. Ava Brooks, steady and unmovable, not demanding attention, not flashing warnings, simply existing with a certainty that did not need to prove itself. And Richard finally turned away from the window, his reflection fading from the glass as he stepped closer to the desk, his hand resting lightly against the surface as if grounding himself in something physical, something real, because everything else had begun to feel abstract, numbers without control, systems without access, power without reach. And in that quiet moment, something shifted again, not outwardly, not in the building or the system or the market, but internally, a recognition forming with clarity he had not allowed himself before. That this was not an attack driven by chaos or emotion. This was a response, measured and exact, and it had been prepared long before last night. And that realization carried with it a different kind of weight, one that did not demand immediate action, but forced reflection. Because somewhere in the sequence of events, somewhere in the structure he had built and trusted, he had overlooked something essential. Not a flaw in the system, but a flaw in perception, in the way he and everyone around him had chosen what to see and what to ignore. And across the building the same quiet understanding began to settle into others, not spoken directly, but felt in the way movement slowed, in the way voices softened, in the way eyes lingered just a little longer on screens that no longer responded. Because when control disappears, people begin to notice what remains. And what remained now was the undeniable presence of a single name holding an entire structure in place, and far from the tower. In that small apartment where the morning light had shifted into something softer, Ava Brooks sat once more. At her desk, not working, not typing, just still, her hands resting lightly in her lap as she listened to the quiet of the room, the distant hum of the city filtering through the window, steady and unchanged. And for a moment she closed her eyes, not in relief, not in triumph, but in something closer to completion, because the moment itself was not the point, the system was not the point. Even the collapse unfolding in slow motion miles away was not the point. The point had been something much smaller, much quieter, something that could not be measured in numbers or transactions. And as she opened her eyes again, the light caught them just briefly, reflecting not what had been taken, but what had always been there, waiting to be seen. By 9:32 a.m., the shift was no longer confined to Caldwell Tower. It had spread beyond glass walls and controlled environments into the wider network of partners, markets, and institutions that had once moved in quiet synchronization with the Caldwell name. And now that synchronization was breaking, not with a crash, but with hesitation, confirmations delayed, approvals paused, automated trust replaced by manual verification, and in the world of high finance, even a second of doubt carried weight. Even a moment of uncertainty could ripple outward into decisions that could not be reversed. And inside the tower, the calls had changed in tone. No longer routine check-ins or confident negotiations, but questions layered with concern, with caution, with something that had not been present before, and Richard Caldwell stood listening to one of them now. The voice on the other in control, but distant, explaining that until the system stabilized, they would need to suspend final authorization on several major agreements, nothing permanent, just a precaution, a word that carried more meaning than it appeared to. And when the call ended, Richard did not move immediately. He stood there with the phone still in his hand, the silence in the room heavier than before, because for the first time the consequences were no longer contained within his own structure. They were visible, measurable, and spreading. And across the building others were reaching the same realization, not through a single announcement, but through a series of small confirmations that aligned into a larger truth, that the system they depended on was not simply malfunctioning. It was being held, guided, controlled by something they did not command. And once that understanding settled, the question shifted, no longer how to fix it, but why it had happened. And that question carried them back to a moment they had all dismissed, a moment that now refused to stay in the past. And as the memory resurfaced, clearer this time, sharper in detail, the connections became impossible to ignore the stillness. In Ava Brooks, the absence of reaction, the single sentence spoken without urgency or fear, and the way she had walked out not as someone dismissed, but as someone finished, and Richard felt it then with unmistakable clarity, not a sudden revelation, but a slow, undeniable alignment of facts, that what they were facing now had not begun this morning. It had not begun in the system. It had begun long before, in choices made without thought, in assumptions left unchallenged, in a perception of power that had overlooked the possibility of something quieter, something patient, something waiting, and that realization did not come with panic. It came with something heavier, something more grounded, because once seen it could not be unseen, and in that moment Richard made a decision, not announced, not shared, but understood in the way he turned from the screens, the way he reached for his coat, the way his movement carried a different kind of urgency, not the urgency to control the system, but to face the source of it. And miles away in the quiet of her apartment, Ava Brooks stood once more by the window, the city now fully awake beneath her, sunlight reflecting off buildings in steady lines, the world continuing forward as it always did, and in the reflection of the glass her figure remained calm, unchanged, because she did not need to watch what was happening, she already understood it. And when her phone lit up softly on the desk behind her, the screen displaying a name she had expected, she did not turn immediately. She let it ring once, twice, the sound filling the room with a quiet rhythm, before finally stepping back, reaching down, and answering not with anticipation, not with tension, but with the same steady calm that had carried her through every moment that led here. Because some conversations do not begin when the call connects, they begin long before, in the silence that made them necessary. The line remained quiet for a moment after she answered, not empty, but filled with the kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that confirms both sides already understand more than they are willing to say. And when Richard Caldwell finally spoke, his voice was different from the one that had filled boardrooms and negotiations for years, stripped of its usual certainty, measured not by authority, but by restraint. "Ava," he said, not as a question, not as a challenge, simply as recognition, and she did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation but out of control, allowing the moment to settle, allowing him to hear the absence of urgency in her silence, because this conversation did not belong to him anymore. And when she did speak, her voice carried the same calm that had followed her through every step of the morning. "You found your way here," she said softly, not impressed, not dismissive, just stating what was already evident. And on the other end, Richard exhaled slowly, the faint sound of it carrying through the line like something released, because there was no advantage left in pretending otherwise, no benefit in maintaining distance. "What you have done," he began, then paused as if searching for a word that no longer fit the situation, "is affecting more than just my company." And the statement hung there, incomplete, because both of them understood that this was not about scale, not about damage, but about control. And Ava turned slightly toward the window, the light shifting across her face, steady and even. "It was never just your company," she replied, her tone unchanged. And in that simple sentence, the structure of the conversation shifted. No longer negotiation, no longer defense, but something closer to truth, something that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And Richard closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because the clarity of it left little room for anything else. And when he spoke again, the question was direct, stripped of layers. "What do you want?" And this time Ava did not let the silence stretch, because the answer did not require time. It had been decided long before the call was made. "Nothing," she said, and for the first time there was a pause on his side that carried real uncertainty, not because he did not understand the word, but because he did not understand the absence of demand, the absence of leverage being used in the way he expected. And Ava continued before he could respond, her voice steady, her words measured. "You built something that depended on control without accountability, on systems that trusted only those who looked like they belonged, and you never questioned what you could not see, and the quiet Weight of that truth settled into the space between them, not as an accusation, but as a conclusion, something already proven. And Richard stood there, the city behind him unchanged, the screens in his office still unresponsive, and for the first time he was not thinking about restoring the system, not calculating losses or recovery timelines, but listening because there was nothing left to interrupt, nothing left to override. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something new, something rare. Can this be reversed? And the question was not framed as a command, not even as a request, but as possibility. And Ava looked out over the city once more, the movement below steady, indifferent, as if the world had already moved past the need for an answer. It already is, she said quietly, just not in the way you think. And the line fell silent again, not empty, but complete. Because some resolutions do not arrive through action. They arrive through understanding. And when the call ended, neither of them moved immediately, each standing in their own space, separated by distance but connected by something far more permanent. The moment where power had shifted not through force, not through demand, but through truth that could no longer be ignored. The city did not pause to mark what had happened. It did not dim its lights or slow its rhythm. It simply continued. Cars moving through intersections, people stepping into offices, screens lighting up across buildings that had no connection to the quiet unraveling that had just passed through one of its tallest towers. And inside Caldwell Tower, the noise had settled into something different. Not resolved, not restored, but quieter, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried the awareness of what had been revealed. And Richard Caldwell stood once more by the window, the phone no longer in his hand. The call already finished, but not forgotten, because the silence that followed it had more weight than any words exchanged. And behind him the screens were still active, still processing, still shifting, but no longer locked in the same way. Access returning in fragments. Systems reopening not all at once, but in measured intervals, like something releasing its hold with intention rather than force. And the numbers on those screens did not return to what they had been, not immediately, perhaps not ever, but they moved again. And that movement, slow and incomplete, carried its own message, not of restoration, but of consequence. And Richard watched it without speaking, without issuing commands, because for the first time he understood that control did not mean dominance. It did not mean ownership. It meant responsibility, something he had overlooked in ways that could not be undone by a single decision. And across the building others felt it too, not as instruction, but as atmosphere, a shift in how they stood, how they spoke, how they looked at the systems they once trusted without question. And outside, far from the glass and steel, Ava Brooks stepped out onto the sidewalk, the late morning light warm against her skin, the air carrying the familiar sounds of a city that never needed to know her name to continue turning. And she walked without hurry, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, because nothing about this moment required recognition. Nothing demanded attention. And as she passed a storefront window, her reflection appeared briefly beside her, clear and simple, not marked by what had been taken the night before, not defined by what had been revealed this morning, just present, whole, and moving forward. And for a second she paused, not to look closer, not to examine,